The pier at noon. The sun over harbour view. Pier poured a clear, forgiving light onto the water, sharpening every ripple so that the bay looked like a sheet of hammered silver. And into that brightness walked a man who carried the quiet of storms survived. Ethan Cole, a 43-year-old Navy veteran whose face showed the soft erosion of time around steady grey eyes and a once-broken nose that had long ago set a fraction off centre, lending his features a rugged, reliable symmetry. He was clean-shaven today, though a shadow hinted at the habit of letting stubble bloom on weekends, and the way he moved, broad-shouldered, straight-backed, despite a stiffness in his right knee that turned his stride into a measured cadence, advertised a life trained to read horizons and accept pain as a companion rather than a judge, while at his side trotted his dog, Scout, a mixed-breed shepherd lab of 9 years with a thick sable coat mapped in charcoal and tan, medium-large in build but softened by age into a gentler silhouette. Scout's gait was slightly rolling from a mild hip issue that came and went like weather, his amber eyes sweeping the pier with alert, affectionate curiosity, a touch of grizzled fur frosting his muzzle, and his temperament always was the same, loyal as a tide, cautious only when Ethan was, and otherwise a tail-thumping ambassador to the world. The pier had its regulars at that hour, a teenage couple sharing a paper tray of fries on a bench facing the ferry lane. An older woman, Camille Ortega, 5'7" with silver hair cut in a confident bob and dark, intelligent eyes behind pale blue frames, wearing a linen blazer and cuffed jeans, who was known among local merchants for her fierce fairness and her carved wood keychain in the shape of an orca. A bait vendor with oil-stained hands and an ocean-weathered face named Rudy Park, 61, neatly trimmed salt and pepper beard, and a shy smile that only appeared when he was measuring squid in brown paper. And Lila Remington, 28, a freelance photographer with a rope of auburn hair tied in a practical knot, olive skin and a constellation of pale freckles on her cheeks, lean and athletic in black jeans and a faded navy jacket, her camera slung across her chest like a talisman that promised clarity. The pier smelled of diesel and salt, of fried dough and brine, of sun-warmed planks and the occasional slap of fish in a blue bucket. Gulls wheeled audaciously, and the water licked the barnacled pilings with a patient, perpetual tongue. Ethan paused near the railing where the bay opened into a corridor toward the naval station, far beyond the ferry slips. A place where memories folded over one another like charted layers. Night watches under cold stars, radar pings, the vibration of steel and promise, and the feeling of being small in a family of giants. The fleet stretched like a floating city under the hard, protective logic of discipline. Scout leaned his chest to the eye, slats, nose tasting the wind, and Ethan, absent-minded, scratched behind his ear, listening to the ferry horns and the far-off rattle of a skateboard. There was a kind of benign choreography to the pier. People moved with a shared understanding that the view was a ceremony, and the benches were pews, and nobody wanted to disrupt the liturgy. Which is precisely why, when a patrol car angled too close to the boardwalk's red-curbed loading zone and a uniformed officer climbed out with a noise like a slammed verdict, heads turned as if a gull had suddenly dipped toward a child's snack. Officer Darren Hale was in his early 30s, 6 feet tall, his tan line neat where buzz-cut brown hair faded to scalp, jaw squared beneath a polished sheen like he shaved twice a day. His brown eyes were a few degrees too flat, as though the world was forever trying to sell him something he already owned. And the way his uniform sat on his large frame suggested hours at the gym under fluorescent lights. A man who built armor and chose to wear it inside and out. He moved with an impatience that flickered through his hands, small drumming motions, quick adjustments to his belt, signals that often precede words too sharp for the room. He had grown up in a neighborhood where loud got results and had learned, on patrol, that decisive volume often displaced actual authority. A habit reinforced by too many nights breaking up fights outside bars and not enough afternoons spent listening to the gentle rhythm of a place like this pier. He stepped onto the boards with the swagger of someone who expected problems and would manufacture them if the world failed to oblige, and immediately he clocked Scout, then Ethan, then Lila's camera, and then the bait vendor, as if scanning for a loose nail in a well-built deck. It started small. A pair of boys with a blue soccer ball kicked it too close to the no-play zone, and the ball tapped the officer's shoe. Hale's lips thinned. He barked at the kids about safety and regulations, and they darted away with apologies. The sound altered the pier's temperature. Conversation thinned, eyes bounced, and then landed elsewhere. Ethan, long practiced in reading threat from 1,000 yards and tension from a breath away, felt the shift like a shallow water shoal under a keel, but said nothing, simply drew Scout a half step behind his leg. Camille Ortega rose and approached, gentle and authoritative the way people who know they are respected can be. She explained that the pier allowed leashed dogs and that the boys were regulars, that the board's posted rules were intended for courtesy, not cudgels. Hale looked at the sign, then at Camille, misreading her as an officious civilian rather than the woman who had helped settle more disputes between tenants and shop owners than his department had written tickets in a week. And he dismissed her with a nod that communicated boredom rather than agreement. Lila's camera clicked. Too quick. Frames Hale's head snapped toward the sound like a hound catching scent. That was when Scout, who had been quiet and square at Ethan's side, lifted his nose, sniffed, and took a single step forward to get a better smell of the seaweed in a plastic tub of bait at Rudy's feet. It was the gentlest of movements, the kind a friendly dog makes when the world is interesting and no one has told him otherwise. And Ethan had already tugged the leash. Back, he said softly. Scout leaned back obediently. When Hale stepped in, not with a word, not with a hand, but with his boot, and he struck Scout's rib with a sharp, punishing kick that thudded against fur and bone and startled the gulls into a sudden, outraged cackle. The world telescoped. The pier's sounds pinholed around the violence like a lens focusing too hard. Scout made a strangled yip, not of aggression, but of wounded surprise, and folded a knee before popping upright again, tail down, eyes bewildered. Ethan's hand closed white around the leash handle. Everything inside him wanted to detonate, but years of training put a vice on his instincts. He breathed once, slow, the breath he had learned on night decks when adrenaline tried to write bad stories in his blood, and he fixed his gaze on Hale. "Officer," he said, voice even, though the words scraped his throat. "You just kicked my dog." Around them, the pier had frozen into a diorama. Camille's chin lifted. Rudy's hands hovered helpless above the bait tub. The teenage couple stood unsure, fries cooling between them. Lila had already stepped closer, camera up, her left hand supporting the lens, right finger half squeezing the shutter so that it could fire with the speed of a heartbeat. Her eyes were wide but steady, a journalist's composure taking over where outrage would be. Hale spread his arms slightly, palms open, half performance, half defense, his voice pitched to carry. "Control your animal," he said. "Leash length is too long. This is a public walkway, not a kennel." Ethan looked down. The leash was a standard 6 foot, clipped to Scout's collar. His free hand shook once with fury, and then went still. "He didn't touch anyone," Ethan said. "Your boot did." Hale took a step closer, so that they shared the same square of sunlight and the smell of aftershave. He looked Ethan up and down, cataloguing without understanding. The faded navy tattoo on his forearm, the scar across his right knuckle, the stance that said, "Fight if you must, not because you can." "You a lawyer?" Hale asked, the corner of his mouth tightening. "You can file a complaint." Ethan hesitated only in the way a man chooses a fork in a road. He reached into his wallet for his driver's license and veteran ID, not to brandish them, but because he knew the choreography when a situation tilted toward paperwork. "I'm asking you," he said, "to apologize to my dog." The request, so simple and human, sounded to Hale like a dare, and in that failure of empathy lay the spark to tinder. "I'm instructing you," Hale replied, "to move along." He shifted his weight as he said it, and the motion jostled his boot against Scout's paw. It wasn't a kick this time, it was contact, careless and avoidable. Scout flinched and curled his toes under. It was enough. "Back," Ethan said to Scout, but his eyes were on Hale. "Officer," Camille said, stepping between them with calculated neutrality, "no one's refusing to comply. We can de-escalate here." She was 5'7" but felt taller when she employed her principal's tone, a way of speaking honed over decades in classrooms and board meetings. Yet Hale didn't hear the years in her voice. He heard only interference, and he turned on her in a way that made Rudy's fingers grip the tub so hard the plastic creaked. "Ma'am, step away," Hale said. "You're obstructing." Lila had moved to the side, framing the scene. Ethan square to Hale. Scout pressed to Ethan's calf. Camille at a diagonal with her hands open in a peaceable blade. The bay glittered behind them like the indifferent eye of a giant. Lila pressed the shutter. The camera chirped, a precise, unemotional witness. A ferry horn bellowed, and with it, as if the sound had been a command from some older authority, something tightened inside Ethan, and then loosened in a different shape. He knew humiliation the way he knew salt and wind, knew how it curdled the heart and heated the head, how it sought an exit, fists, insults, a dozen bad decisions. And he had sworn, years ago in a desert wind, that he would not be a doorway for that thing. He took a half step back and placed himself between Hale and Scout. And he spoke not in a shout, but in a tone that had once carried from forecastle to fantail without a megaphone. "I am moving along," he said, "and you will not touch my dog again." For a beat, silence held. Then Hale laughed, not with humor, but with the brittle sound of a man who refuses the dignity of another. "Or what?" he said, leaning in, the brim of his cap shadowing his eyes. "You going to call someone to come save you?" It was a taunt tossed by reflex, a man's armor trying to rattle a cage. But the words had an unintended gravity in this place, on this pier, within sight of the channel that led to a grey geometry of ships and a community that measured respect with ceremonies louder than laughter. Ethan could have said 100 things, could have recited policy, could have demanded a supervisor, could have turned and stalked away. But what he did was simpler. He let the wind carry his next breath out toward the water. "No," he said, and the syllable had the ease of truth. "I don't need saving." And then he did something that wasn't planned but felt as natural as checking a line. He raised 2 fingers to his brow and gave the bay a crisp, old-fashioned salute. A tiny private ritual done in public, the way a man nods to a friend across a crowded room. It wasn't meant for Hale. It wasn't even fully meant for the ships out there. It was meant for the boy he had been, and the men and women he had served with, and the dog at his leg who had taught him what loyalty tastes like when it's salted with age. Lila's camera whispered 3 more frames. Camille exhaled. Rudy blinked. Hale scoffed and began to say something about disorderly conduct, but in the pause between his thought and his voice, there came up the channel a vibration too low to be heard and too certain to be ignored. A tremor beneath the boards, a far-off thunder that rolled up from the water like the sound of a city waking. The gulls stuttered. The ferry's horn answered, long and ceremonious. Lila turned first, then everyone turned, because even people who don't know ships know a sound that summons attention like a bell. "What's that?" the teenage boy said, voice suddenly small. Out past the ferry lane, beyond the buoys that marked the channel, a grey shape parted the light. Then another, angles and holes, and the sharp lines of discipline cutting across the bay. The leading destroyer's deck crew, a row of white figures against the darker ship, stood like punctuation to a sentence the water itself was writing. Ethan didn't move. He had no radio, no signal, no secret handshakes with anyone out there. Nothing in his pockets but a worn wallet and a receipt for dog treats. But the world had found its own way of answering a question that Hale hadn't known he'd asked. As the first ship drew parallel with the pier, the destroyer's whistle pealed, clear, sonorous, carrying. Sailors lined the deck rails in their dress whites like stitches on a flag, and in a motion perfectly synchronized, as if the ship itself had a heartbeat. They raised their hands to their brows and held a salute that reached like a bridge from steel to wood, from duty to the man on the pier who had saluted his memory. People gasped. Phones came out. Lila, who had the instincts of a professional and the awe of a citizen, scrambled up onto the bench to frame the men in white with Ethan in the foreground. Scout's ears peaked, the officer swallowed by the grandness of the gesture that had no room for him. Hale's mouth opened and closed. Whatever citation he had been rehearsing lost its footing and fell mutely into the slats. The drift of ceremony rolled down the water, the second ship's crew following the first, and Ethan, stunned and particular in his gratitude, felt his throat tighten in a way he hadn't planned for. He did not look at Hale. He looked at the sailors and gave them a measured, grateful nod, his eyes stinging, while Scout leaned warm against his shin, tail beginning, at last, to lift. The pier had not expected a pageant, and yet as the second ship's horn reverberated across the water, the atmosphere transformed into something ceremonial, as though an invisible curtain had lifted to reveal a stage grander than any petty confrontation could ever deserve, and all who stood there felt the vibration in their bones. Ethan remained motionless, his posture carrying the stoicism of a man who had drilled himself for decades not to flinch in the face of spectacle. Yet inside his chest, his heart struck a rhythm that betrayed how deeply this moment touched him. Because while the Navy fleet did not come for him personally, the synchronicity of their salute, the timing of their arrival, and the contrast against the smallness of Officer Hale's aggression felt like an act of cosmic choreography designed to restore balance to the insult that had been delivered. Scout, whose ribs still tingled faintly from the officer's boot, pressed his side against Ethan's leg as though to remind himself that his anchor stood tall, and the dog's loyalty, simple and unshakable, threaded seamlessly into the majesty of the scene. Hale, by contrast, stood diminished. His brown eyes darted between the unfolding procession of ships and the gathering crowd who now watched with new calculation, and his jaw worked as if chewing on excuses that would not swallow. People were lifting their phones, recording, narrating in hurried whispers. The teenage couple spoke into a camera app with a mix of awe and outrage. Rudy Park muttered prayers of thanks to ancestors he believed had guided sailors across centuries, and Camille Ortega stood with her arms crossed, her expression carved from stone, silently daring Hale to continue in his arrogance while the weight of something far larger bore down on him. Lila Remington, camera at her eye, snapped with deliberate artistry now, recognizing this was no longer just documentation of misconduct, but the birth of a narrative that would travel far beyond Harborview Pier. She adjusted aperture, framed Ethan with Scout in sharp focus, while the blurred background captured the immaculate rows of sailors saluting. And in her mind, she was already crafting captions, the words "respect" and "justice" pulsing like headlines waiting to attach themselves to the images. Ethan finally broke his stillness by kneeling beside Scout, running his hand down the dog's back in a motion that was more about reassurance than examination. His grey eyes narrowing as he checked for signs of real harm, and Scout responded with a slow, affirming lick across Ethan's wrist, his tail thumping against the boards at last, as if he too understood the tide of dignity had turned in their favour. The crowd began to murmur louder, snippets carried on the sea breeze. "They're saluting him, aren't they? Is he someone important? He's a vet, look, you can tell." And the collective realization bloomed like fire through dry grass. The man who had been kicked down in symbol had been elevated in truth by forces that wore no badge but carried more authority than any local patrol car could muster. Officer Hale attempted to salvage ground. He reached for his radio, muttered into it as though summoning reinforcements. But his words cracked at the edges, too brittle, because the optics of a uniformed officer standing against a veteran while the Navy fleet itself offered respect was a tableau too powerful to reshape with bureaucratic language. Camille, seizing the moment, stepped forward and addressed the small crowd with the calm gravitas of someone accustomed to meetings where fairness was currency. "This gentleman and his service dog have every right to be here. What we just witnessed reminds us that respect is not given by authority. It is earned by sacrifice." Her voice carried, crisp against the backdrop of horns and gulls, and murmurs of agreement followed her like a tide. Hale glared, but said nothing. His authority, once assumed, now felt provisional, hanging by a fraying thread of defensiveness. Ethan finally rose, squaring his shoulders in that subtle yet unmistakable military way, and looked not at Hale, but at the sailors in the distance, who still held their salute in perfect symmetry. He lifted his hand once more to his brow, a crisp, dignified acknowledgement, then lowered it slowly, signaling gratitude without theatrics. Scout barked once, sharp and resolute, the sound punctuating the ceremony like an exclamation mark at the end of a hymn, and the crowd erupted, not in cheers, but in applause, the respectful kind that carries both awe and vindication. The clap of hands, the flutter of camera shutters, the hum of recording devices. Together they composed an unplanned orchestra that buried Hale in a soundscape of accountability. Lila, lowering her camera, whispered to herself, "This is going to go everywhere," already imagining how the photographs would resonate on screens across the country, igniting debates about respect, authority, and dignity. Rudy Park stepped closer to Ethan, pressing a rough, weathered hand against the veteran's shoulder, his voice low but steady. "They see you." They remember. Ethan nodded, his eyes momentarily glassy, but he did not speak. Words, he knew, would have been too fragile against the immensity of the gesture surrounding him. Hale, red-faced, muttered something about moving on, but even his posture betrayed that he had been relegated to the margins of a story far larger than him. The destroyers continued their glide across the bay, and as each ship passed the pier, its crew repeated the salute in echoing precision, transforming Harbourview Pier into a sacred arena of remembrance. For Ethan, it was not triumph over a petty insult, but communion with the life he had once lived, and the unspoken bond that connected all who had worn the uniform. For Scout, it was reassurance that his pain had not gone unseen. For the crowd, it was revelation that the world could still deliver poetry at the exact moment it was needed most. And as the last ship's whistle trailed into silence, the pier exhaled as one, knowing instinctively that they had all witnessed the beginning of a story that would not end at the water's edge. When the last echo of the fleet's whistle dissolved into the air, Harbourview Pier felt altered, like a theatre whose audience knew the script had broken open to reveal something larger than entertainment. People lingered, hesitant to return to normal rhythms, their conversations now laced with urgency, as if they had all been appointed witnesses to history. Ethan stood calm at the centre, though his insides were far from still. The salute had struck him in places too deep for words, places where memories of long deployments, folded flags, and comrades left behind lay buried beneath years of silence. And now those memories surfaced, raw, yet strangely healing. Scout leaned against his shin, tail wagging slowly, the throb in his ribs forgotten in the reassurance that his person had stood tall and the world had answered. Officer Hale, however, was unravelling. His authority, once asserted with a boot and a bark, had been eclipsed, and in its shadow he felt exposed, desperate to reclaim ground. His hand hovered near his radio again, but the murmurs of the crowd drowned any potential command, their attention not on him, but on Ethan. A young boy, in a red hoodie, no more than 12, tugged at his mother's sleeve and whispered, "Mum, is he a hero?" The word carried, amplified by innocence, and Camille Ortega, always alert to moments that defined narratives, turned toward the boy with a solemn nod and said, "Yes, he is." Phones captured that too, the confirmation that would thread through headlines. Lila, adrenaline still sparking, reviewed the images in her camera with quick flicks of her thumb, each frame a perfect storm of composition and meaning. Hale's boot in motion, Scout recoiling, Ethan's dignified stillness, the ships saluting in the background. She knew instinctively that these photographs would not just make local news. They would travel across wires, ignite debates on respect, power, and the treatment of veterans. Rudy Park shuffled nearer, his weathered face trembling with emotion. "I've been here 30 years," he murmured to Ethan, his eyes glistening. "Never seen anything like this. You gave us something to remember." Ethan, uncomfortable with being the locus of such attention, inclined his head slightly in gratitude, his voice low and controlled. "It wasn't me. It was them," he said, gesturing toward the ships disappearing into the horizon. Yet even as he tried to deflect, he knew the truth was more complicated. Sometimes a single gesture, like a salute, became a mirror in which an entire community saw itself differently. Hale made one last attempt to salvage his standing. "This crowd needs to disperse," he announced, louder than necessary. But his voice carried no weight. It was drowned by the low, rolling applause that had not fully died down, applause that now reignited as people openly turned their backs to him, symbolically stripping his authority. Camille, stepping forward with the precision of a leader seizing the moment, addressed Ethan directly, though her words were meant for every ear on the pier. "You reminded us today that respect cannot be demanded through fear or force. It must be honored through sacrifice and dignity. That is why they saluted you." The crowd murmured agreement, the sound gathering momentum. Hale, red creeping up his neck, finally retreated to his patrol car, his boots thudding hollowly on the boards. And when he slammed the door, the crowd exhaled relief as though a storm cloud had drifted past. Ethan bent once more to check Scout, rubbing gently along his ribs, whispering soft reassurances, and the dog nuzzled him back, eager to absorb his calm. It was then that Lila approached cautiously, holding her camera like a peace offering. "Sir," she said, her voice respectful but urgent, "these photos, may I share them? People need to see what happened here." Ethan studied her for a long beat, his grey eyes measuring her intent. She was earnest, her freckles standing out in the sunlight, her auburn hair catching glints of gold. She reminded him of young correspondents he had seen in war zones, chasing truth with more courage than armor. Finally, he nodded once. "Show them the truth," he said simply. She smiled in relief, already crafting the story in her mind. As the crowd began to disperse, still buzzing with what they had witnessed, Ethan remained at the rail, staring out at the diminishing silhouettes of the ships. Scout sat pressed against his leg, his amber eyes reflecting the shimmer of the bay. In that moment, Ethan felt something he had not allowed himself in years. Recognition, not from medals or ceremonies, but from the silent bond of those who had once served alongside him. An acknowledgement that his sacrifices had not dissolved into the fog of anonymity. Yet with that recognition came a burden. He knew this story would ripple beyond the pier, that Hale's kick and the fleet's salute would become symbols debated far beyond his control. And as he stood there, the sea breeze tugging at his shirt, Ethan realized that what had begun as a walk with his dog had transformed into a reckoning, one that would not end when the sun set over Harbourview Pier. Do you want me to move ahead with Chapter 4? 1,500 words, continuous cinematic narration? Chapter 4. The Weight of Virality. By the time Ethan guided Scout off the pier and back toward the narrow street lined with bait shops and souvenir stalls, the event had already escaped his control, carried in the circuits of 100 phones and cameras, flickering onto social feeds faster than the tide could roll back in. Lila Remington, quick to upload her photographs to a cloud account with captions written in the breathless shorthand of urgency, had not anticipated how immediately they would explode. By the time she caught up to Ethan in the parking lot, a news aggregator in another city had already reposted her images under the headline, "Veteran and Dog Saluted by Navy Fleet After Confrontation with Local Cop." Ethan, unaware of the digital wildfire, moved with the same measured pace he always did, his hand steady on Scout's leash, his mind working not in hashtags, but in the slow cadence of reflection. He was not naive. He knew enough about the modern world to recognize the weight of witnesses with cameras, but he could not yet comprehend that this story would stretch far beyond Harbourview Pier before the day was over. Scout walked close, his ribs no longer sore, but his spirit unusually alert, ears twitching at every passerby, as if he too understood that attention had shifted, Their eyes followed them now with something more complex than curiosity. A young woman in yoga attire paused, phone half lifted, then approached with reverence in her voice. "Sir, I just wanted to thank you for your service. That was incredible what happened back there." Ethan inclined his head politely, his grey eyes steady but inward, murmuring, "Thank you, ma'am," before moving on. He did not linger in praise. It unsettled him, reminded him of the staged ceremonies after deployments when cameras flashed, but the struggles of reintegration remained invisible once the lights dimmed. He had learned that real respect came quietly, like the handshake of an old shipmate in a grocery store aisle, or the loyalty of a dog who slept at your feet through nightmares. But virality had its own logic, and it did not ask for permission. At a cafe overlooking the marina, a group of college students clustered around a tablet, replaying a clip of Scout's startled yelp and Ethan's calm defiance, followed by the thunderous salute of sailors in whites. Their voices overlapped. "Man, that cop's done for. Look at the way the dog looked at him. Heartbreaking. Dude, the timing of the ships? You can't write that." In the corner, a retired longshoreman named Dennis Cho shook his head slowly, whispering to no one in particular, "That's bigger than news. That's truth telling itself." Meanwhile, Officer Hale sat in his patrol car 2 blocks away, sweating under the air conditioning that blasted like an apology. His hands gripped the steering wheel too tightly, knuckles pale as he replayed the scene in his head, not as it happened, but as it would be spun, twisted, magnified. He knew the department would call him in, that internal affairs might open a file, that the union rep would insist it wasn't as bad as it looked. But the sinking weight in his gut told him otherwise. He had underestimated the Pier, underestimated the man with the calm eyes, underestimated the dog whose loyalty could not be kicked away. He cursed under his breath, resentment boiling. Yet beneath the anger was fear. A gnawing fear of being remembered not for all the tickets and busts and reports, but for one moment where arrogance had met consequence. Back at the pier, Camille Ortega lingered near Rudy's bait stand, debriefing with him in hushed tones. "You saw the way he stood," she said, eyes still fixed on the horizon. "That wasn't just stubbornness. That was command. People will follow," that Rudy nodded, wiping his hands on a rag. "And the fleet? Lord, the fleet don't salute by accident. Even if it was coincidence, it felt like judgment." Camille pursed her lips, knowing how narratives took root. Truth mattered less than resonance. And this story resonated like a struck bell. She resolved quietly to protect Ethan if the coming storm grew ugly, because she sensed already that he would not fight for himself in the realm of headlines and politics. He would stand steady, but he would not chase vindication. Someone else would need to guard his dignity from opportunists. Lila caught up to Ethan at the edge of the lot, out of breath from both running and exhilaration. Sir, wait," she called, her camera bouncing against her hip. He paused, Scout circling to sit by his calf. "My name's Lila Remington. I'm a freelance photographer, but today—" She hesitated, searching for the right words, freckles bright against flushed cheeks. "Today, you became more than a subject. People are already talking. This is going to travel." Ethan studied her, saw the eagerness in her eyes tempered by sincerity, and sighed softly. "I didn't ask for it to travel," he said. Lila bit her lip. "I know. But sometimes the story isn't ours once it begins." Ethan nodded at that because he understood. He had seen battles that grew beyond any commander's plan. As the afternoon deepened, local reporters began to descend, tipped off by the swell of social media. Vans parked crooked along the pier road, logos plastered on their sides, anchors adjusting ties and smoothing hair in reflective glass. Microphones jutted toward strangers, gathering sound bites about what had happened. The boy in the red hoodie repeating, "They saluted him." They saluted the man and his dog. Camille giving a composed but firm statement about respect and authority. Rudy stumbling through an emotional recollection, his voice breaking when he described Scout's yelp. Clips spread, stitched together, into a mosaic of outrage and reverence. Ethan, seeking to escape the noise, retreated with Scout into the shade of an elm near the Veterans Memorial a block inland, the bronze plaques cool and dignified against the chaos brewing beyond. He sat on a bench, Scout curling at his feet, and let the wind play across his face. He wanted quiet, but the world would not allow it now, because while Ethan sought stillness, the internet thrived on momentum. By evening, hashtags bloomed like wildfire. Hashtag salute the veteran, hashtag justice for Scout, hashtag peer respect. Each one carrying the story further, reshaping it, amplifying it. Some framed Ethan as a hero resisting tyranny, others as a symbol of veterans ignored until spectacle forced recognition. A few contrarians tried to defend Hale, citing leash laws, but their voices drowned in the tide of images too powerful to deny. The dog recoiling, the veteran saluting, the fleet answering. A senator retweeted Lila's photo with the caption, "Respect is earned, not enforced." A morning show producer left a voicemail on Camille's phone, requesting contact with the man in the pictures. And so, as twilight painted the bay in bruised purples and gold, Ethan sat unaware of the scale his story had reached, his mind still replaying the moment Scout yelped and the instant he chose restraint over rage. He did not yet know that tomorrow would bring television crews to his door, that pundits would argue his name on split screens, that Officer Hale's career would hang by a thread, or that the Navy itself might be called to explain the uncanny timing of its salute. All he knew was that Scout was safe, that dignity had been preserved in the face of insult, and that for one fleeting, eternal moment, the sea itself had seemed to rise in his defense. By morning, the harbour woke to a choreography that felt both official and improvised, as if the town itself had been drafted into service. Trucks with collapsible risers clattered onto the promenade, metal barricades sprouted along the pier like rails for guiding a river of people, and city workers, in neon vests, unfurled cables that snaked toward a low stage backed by the water, where gulls had become the accidental heralds of a day no one had scheduled, yet everyone expected. And in the center of that expectancy walked Ethan Cole in a clean blue chambray shirt that fit his broad shoulders with an unstudied neatness. His grey eyes quieter now, but still ringed by the sleeplessness of a man who had tried to outrun attention and discovered it had longer legs. Beside him pattered Scout, 9 years old and grizzled at the muzzle, his sable and tan coat brushed into a muted shine, his gait steady with only the slightest sea sway from aging hips, and his temperament the loyal, alert warmth of a dog who reads a crowd like weather, anchoring Ethan more surely than any medal could. The town had arrived with its opinions polished, shopkeepers in aprons, fishermen in faded ball caps, a stroller brigade of mothers with iced coffees, retired couples who held hands as if steadying one another against the gusts of history, and threaded among them cameras, boom mics, the hungry optics of national networks, lenses hunting for angles like gulls for fries. Lila Remington cut through the bustle with a backpack and a purpose. Auburn hair in a knot, olive skin lit by the kind of morning sun that made every freckle a punctuation mark. She moved in fast arcs, checking light, framing Scout against the chrome glint of the bay, her voice a focused hush when she called to older reporters by name. She knew them now. Wait for the statement, don't bait the man. And then she slid into a corner of the riser where her camera could see without intruding, where truth could arrive without being shoved. The police came in a smaller, chastened formation. Chief Arturo Morales, 58, tall but without swagger, salt grey hair trimmed close above a face built for listening more than for pronouncing, his charcoal suit crisp over a runner's frame, and behind him 2 commanders with notebooks, plus Officer Darren Hale, in uniform, and minus his usual aura of certainty, his square jaw smooth-shaven but clenched, his eyes restless, and his posture betraying the uneasy balance between defiance and fear that men sometimes wear when the mirror of consequence is held too close to their faces. Morales had spent his career learning that communities forgive more slowly than they forget, and that the quickest route to either is honesty. He had grown up the son of a longshoreman and a night shift nurse, carried their humility like a pocket charm, and now he felt the weight of his badge as a promise rather than a shield. He met Ethan at the foot of the stage with a hand offered not as a performative clasp but as contact, and Ethan accepted it, their grip short, firm, unadorned, Scout sniffing Morales' cuff and granting a small thump of tail as if to say, "This one understands tone." "Mr. Cole," Morales said, not the usual sir, because he sensed the veteran would not want the ceremony of hierarchy layered over him today. "Thank you for coming. We're going to do this properly." Ethan's nod was the kind that replaced whole paragraphs. He had no appetite for speeches, only for truth arranged in a row. From the base across the channel came a lean white van marked with the crest of the Public Affairs Office, and out stepped Lieutenant Commander Ava Brooks, 37, 5'8", with a runner's calves and the smooth, economical posture of a woman who had mastered the art of standing still under scrutiny. She wore Navy service dress whites with insignia that told a quiet story to those who could read it. A surface warfare pin earned the hard way, a ribbon stack modest but precise, and her hair, black and glossy, was coiled into a perfect bun that did not move even when the sea breeze tugged at flags. Her skin held a warm copper tone that caught the morning light, and her eyes, a dark, keen brown, scanned the crowd quickly, not with suspicion, but with the protective calculus of someone who understands that narratives are fragile vessels that can be cracked by a single careless word. She approached Ethan with a professional gentleness, introduced herself with a voice pitched to be heard but not to dominate, and asked, "May I say a few words about yesterday's transit?" Ethan lifted a hand in assent, half-smile flickering. He already liked her because she did not presume. When the microphones warmed and Morales stepped to the lectern, the crowd condensed into a single listening body. He did not clear his throat, did not arrange papers he didn't need, did not thank a roster of officials. He went straight. "Yesterday on this pier," he said, "an officer from my department kicked a leashed, compliant service animal and escalated a peaceful moment into an unnecessary confrontation. That is not who we are sworn to be." A ripple moved through the crowd, some relief, some anger, and Hale's jaw notched tighter. The cameras drank in his face and found no good angles. Morales continued, "We have initiated an internal affairs investigation. Officer Hale has been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome. Regardless of that process, we owe this community and Mr. Cole an apology." He stepped aside, and the space he left was shaped exactly like responsibility. Ava Brooks took the microphone next, her whites bright against the bay. "Harbour transits are scheduled months in advance," she said, voice steady. "So yesterday's passage was planned and routine. But sailors notice the world they serve, and they honour what deserves honour. When personnel on deck observed a veteran rendering a salute on this pier, they responded with one of their own. It was not political. It was not coordinated with any agency. It was simply respect, answering respect." She let the words settle. The town absorbed them with the kind of silence that has decision in it. "On behalf of the base," she added, glancing at Ethan, softening, "we're grateful for Mr. Cole's service and for the example he set yesterday of restraint under provocation." She turned slightly, and a petty officer in dress whites, Petty Officer Second Class Emmanuel Ruiz, 24, compact and precise, brown skin and a smile he tried to hide, stepped forward with a plain wooden shadow box containing a folded flag that had flown over the base the previous week and a small brass plaque etched with the date. Ava did not present it with flourish. She carried it down from the riser and placed it into Ethan's hands as if handing over something delicate that belonged to him already. Ethan's throat tightened. His fingers, strong but marked with old scars, traced the flag's edge through glass. He lifted his eyes to Ava and then, past her, to the sailors who had accompanied her across in the van, a handful of deck crew in their whites, standing at modest parade rest along the edge of the riser like punctuation to a sentence about discipline. He wanted to say something disproportionate, to tell them about the night watches, about the radar pings and steel decks in winter, about how the ocean teaches you what kind of man you are and does it without raising its voice. But he kept the moment simple, because that was the language the sea respected. "Thank you," he said, his voice low and even, and Scout, sensing the tremor, pressed his shoulder into Ethan's calf and looked up with amber eyes that held questions and answers both. Then came the part the crowd had sharpened itself for. Morales gestured to Hale. The officer's boots sounded louder than they should on the wooden steps, each thud a metronome for a shrinking future. Up close, his face showed the fatigue of a night spent rehearsing justifications and discarding them when they tasted like metal. He stopped 3 feet from Ethan and the dog he had hurt, chest rising against the constriction of his vest, and for a split second, he looked like a boy pressed too hard by a world he didn't understand. "Officer Hale," Morales said, not unkindly but without insulation, "you have something to say." Hale nodded once, swallowed, turned to the microphone, then chose not to use it. He pivoted toward Ethan and Scout instead, lowering his voice so that intimacy would carry farther than amplification. "Mr. Cole," he began, the words dragging their feet, "yesterday I was wrong. I misjudged the situation. I kicked your dog. It was a misuse of authority." His next breath was ragged. "I'm sorry." He paused, and eyes traveled from faces to paws as if to find the correct recipient. Then he did the only thing that could possibly pry open a locked room. He stepped down from the riser, went to a knee so that he was level with Scout, and spoke to the animal whose yelp had become accusation and anthem. "Scout," he said, his voice catching on the single syllable. "I hurt you. I'm sorry, buddy." His hand hovered, empty, offered, not presuming a touch. For a moment the world balanced on a hair, waiting to see whether justice can be companion to mercy. Scout looked to Ethan. Dogs have always known how to ask permission without words, and Ethan's steady nod was the green light of grace. The dog leaned forward, sniffed Hale's hand, then gave a tentative lick, the kind that is less about forgiveness than about acknowledging the present as a place where better choices might begin. A sound went through the crowd, not a cheer, but an exhale that had been held for a day. Lila's shutter fell in a gentle cascade, frame after frame of an apology calibrated by humility and received by a creature who had no use for performative righteousness. Hale stood slowly, and when he did, some tightness in his face had unclenched, replaced by an older fatigue, the kind you feel when the armor you've been polishing is finally set down. He met Ethan's eyes, and Ethan, who could have used the moment to humiliate, chose something else. "Be the man you meant to be when you pinned that badge," he said, quiet enough that only Hale and the front row heard. Hale nodded, a small sobered bow, then stepped back beside Morales, like a soldier who had returned from a reconnaissance of himself. The formalities spilled into conversations that felt like repair. Camille Ortega, hugging Ethan with the controlled fierceness of a woman who deploys warmth the way others deploy strategy, whispering, "Proud of you, son," though she had no claim to him beyond shared citizenship. Rudy Park, shuffling forward with a paper bag of smoked salmon he'd meant to save for lunch, and pressing it into Ethan's hands because food is the grammar of respect among people who work with their hands. Petty Officer Ruiz, kneeling to scratch Scout behind the ear in that exact seam of fur where pleasure flips a dog's eyelids into crescent moons. Ava Brooks, standing off to the side with arms folded, watching the town perform the slow, necessary work of stitching the tear. Lila approached last, not with a camera, but with a print she had made at dawn in the 1-hour lab on Main. Ethan in the foreground, Scout's ears angled like tuned antennas. The destroyer's crew, a luminous blur of white along the horizon, an image that looked like memory itself. "For you," she said, "no watermarks, no rights reserved." Ethan took it with the same care he had given the flag, studying the photograph with a craftsman's attention, then surprised himself by laughing, a soft, rusty sound. "You caught the wind," he said, and Lila smiled the proud, shy smile of someone who had hoped to do, Exactly that. As midday burned into a bright, almost theatrical blue, the pier loosened, barriers lifted, reporters drifted toward vans to cut segments, and the town reorganized itself into its regular tasks with a difference that did not show on the surface, but lived inside how people stepped around one another, how they spoke to dogs at leashes, how they looked at the bay as if it had been appointed witness and judge. Morales returned to the precinct with a list of reforms he had kept in a desk drawer and now felt brave enough to pull into daylight. De-escalation refreshers that centered dignity, community liaisons who wore sneakers not boots, a policy that named animals as beings rather than property and incident reports, quiet moves that changed the weather over months rather than days. Hale drove home not to rehearse defenses, but to sit in a room where his own boyhood baseball gloves still smelled of oil and dust. He thought about why he had chosen this work and when he had forgotten the reasons, and he made a small, unglamorous promise to show up to counseling without rolling his eyes. Ava returned across the water, checked in with a commanding officer who had watched a live stream with arms crossed and eyes soft, and filed a report that read like a poem disguised as a memo. Plain, clear, grateful. Lila sifted through thousands of frames and chose 10 that told the arc without exaggeration, then wrote a caption that named no villains and elevated only what deserved lifting. Restraint, apology, salute. Camille drafted a letter to the city board about a permanent sign on the pier, honoring veterans and service animals. Rudy taped a hand-lettered note to his bait cooler. Dogs welcome, boots be gentle, and the mothers with strollers traded a look that said they would remember whom to call when a badge forgot its manners. And Ethan? He took Scout to the small park near the memorial where the shade thickened like a hush and sat on the bench they favored, the folded flag and the print in his lap. The town's noise softened by trees. He watched Scout nose at a patch of clover, sneeze, then flop with a satisfied grunt that shook leaves into a confetti of late morning. He let the dog's simplicity bleed the drama out of the day until what remained was the good marrow of it. An insult met without violence. A community deciding it liked itself better when it chose respect. A fleet salute catching sunlight long enough to remind everyone that sometimes the universe times its whispers perfectly. He did not feel heroic. He felt ordinary in a way that tasted like peace. In the distance, a horn sounded, not ceremonial now, just a ferry's schedule keeping its promises. And Ethan rose, pocketed the photo, shouldered the shadow box carefully, and clicked his tongue for Scout. "Come on, old man," he said, and the dog's ears flicked as if catching a private frequency only the two of them could hear. Together they walked toward a lunch they would eat without hurrying. Two small figures absorbing a town's large lesson. The bay bright enough to convince even skeptics that dignity, once chosen, can turn a page and keep it turned. In the days that followed, Harbourview Pier became less a stretch of wooden boards over salt water and more a living symbol, a place where memory and meaning braided together so tightly that every gull's cry and ferry's horn seemed to carry an echo of what had transpired. Visitors arrived not simply to watch the bay or eat fried dough, but to stand where a veteran had saluted and a fleet had answered, where a dog's wounded yelp had become the spark of a community's reckoning. Ethan Cole, though, did not think of himself as the center of it. He was a man who had lived long enough to know that moments belong not to the individual, but to the collective. That history is written not in the intent of the actor, but in the interpretation of the witnesses, and so he returned each morning to the pier with Scout, not to perform, but to continue the rhythm of his life. A walk, a pause at the railing, a scratch behind the dog's ear, a stare toward the horizon where steel-grey ships sometimes cut the water. Scout, resilient as ever, carried his years with dignity. The bruise on his rib faded beneath his thick sable coat, his gait still rolling with age. But his eyes, bright amber orbs lit by loyalty, remained constant, and children now rushed to pet him with reverence as though he were less an animal than an emblem of endurance. Ethan accepted it with gentle nods, his patience tested but never broken, and when someone inevitably asked for a photo, he would agree, Scout sitting square and proud at his side, unaware that his presence soothed more hearts than any speech could. The town adjusted around the story. Rudy Park taped laminated copies of Lila's photos to the side of his bait stand, his weathered hands proud to straighten them whenever the sea breeze curled an edge. Camille Ortega pushed through the city council the installation of a bronze plaque near the pier's entrance, reading, "Here respect answered respect, and a community chose dignity over fear." Her blue-framed glasses glinting as she cut the ribbon on a brisk morning while school children held tiny flags and Scout basked in the attention like a king on holiday. Lila Remington, no longer just a freelancer hustling for assignments, found her inbox flooded with requests, but she stayed true to the story's heart, choosing only to license images that emphasized honor, restraint, and reconciliation. Her auburn hair now familiar in newsrooms that prized integrity as much as clarity. Chief Morales rolled out his reforms quietly but firmly, instituting de-escalation workshops and canine empathy modules. And when skeptics scoffed, he told them to look into Scout's eyes and say, dogs weren't worthy of consideration. Even Hale attended the sessions, his square jaw less rigid these days, his voice quieter, his steps measured like a man who had walked to the brink of losing everything and turned back in time. He was not universally forgiven, but he was working, showing up early, listening longer, taking notes not for show, but because he wanted to rebuild brick by brick. And Ethan, seeing him once across a street, gave him a nod that was not friendship, but was no longer condemnation. And that, perhaps, was enough. Nationally, the images traveled farther than anyone predicted. Talk shows debated the symbolism. Veterans groups rallied around Ethan's composure. Animal welfare advocates seized upon Scout as a mascot of resilience. And the Navy's Public Affairs Office carefully reiterated Ava Brooks's words, that the salute had been spontaneous, not staged, a pure gesture of mutual recognition. What no press release could capture, however, was how the moment reshaped the community itself. The pier became a site of quiet pilgrimages, where fathers brought sons to teach them what respect looks like, where young officers stood silently at the rail to remind themselves why they wore uniforms, where ordinary people paused to consider the difference between authority imposed and authority earned. Ethan remained the same man outwardly, grey eyes steady, right knee stiff, laugh rare but real. But inwardly, he felt a weight lift, as though the years of service and sacrifice that had lain invisible on his shoulders had finally been acknowledged by the very sea that had once commanded his life. On one evening, weeks later, as the sun sank behind the naval base and painted the bay in molten copper, Ethan returned to the pier with Scout at his side, the air sharp with autumn. Lila spotted him and approached with her camera, but instead of lifting it, she sat beside him on the bench, the auburn strands of her hair catching the last light. "You know," she said softly, "they're going to remember this place for a long time because of you." Ethan shook his head, his profile outlined against the horizon. "Because of us," he corrected, nodding toward Scout, toward her, toward the plaque near the entrance and the bay beyond. Moments don't belong to people. They belong to the world. Scout barked once, tail sweeping against the boards as though affirming the thought, and Ethan reached down to scratch the dog's muzzle, feeling gratitude pulse through his veins like tidewater. Together, they sat in silence as gulls wheeled overhead and the ships in the distance glowed faintly under deck lights. And for the first time in many years, Ethan Cole felt at peace with both his past and his present, knowing that when the fleet had saluted, it had not only honored his service, but had reminded an entire community what dignity truly means.